Okay, thank you for that, and thank you to the Guild of Beer Writers for inviting me. I think thanks is in order. I was asked to do this at the last minute because Roger Potts was taken ill. So I got the call from Pete Brown saying, how are you fixed? So I put a few slides together, which thankfully the technology has worked, which I hope you'll find interesting. And most of the slides, if not all of them, have come from the National Brewery Centre. So let me tell you a story. Beer brewing in Burton can be dated back to at least to the 12th century, and the town's brewers had gained a reputation for the flavour and keeping qualities of their beers long before the advent of Pale Ale, or India Pale Ale. But it's Burton's association with this particular style of beer which was to make the town world famous. You lost me. Wingman. And it was India Pale Ale that town has always been associated with, and it became known as the brewing capital of the world in the mid-1800s. How that came about was perhaps a mix of good luck and circumstance, but it's also a combination of sharp business acumen, shrewd judgment, sound management, and in fact just sheer hard work. The rise of Burton's brewers really began in the early 1700s, when the River Trent was made navigable as far as Burton, and the town became a distribution centre for the Midlands, especially for imports from and exports to Scandinavia and Hull. So next, thanks. That's a few barges from, if you look carefully, that's the Trent Navigation Company, which was founded, say, in the early 1700s. And a number of merchant brewers or brewer traders developed in the town. They weren't just brewing was part of what they did, but in fact they were just general, well, I shouldn't say just, they were general traders, and they saw an opportunity. They combined the export of beer with the import of timber and iron. And by the middle of the 18th century, beer from Burton was being exported to Prussia, to Scandinavia, the Baltic ports, and to Russia. And brewing was recognised as a major industry in the town. So by 1780, the number of common brewers in Burton had increased to 13, albeit they were all fairly small family concerns, and the total annual volume out of the town then was around 20,000 barrels, of which over nearly half, 40% anyway, was exported. And the population of Burton was still only around 4,000, so it's quite a major activity in the town. Next one, please. Thanks. That's the Baltic trader applying the whole trade. But as we've already heard, in the early 1800s, there was the introduction of increasingly restrictive import tariffs by Russia, and together with the blockading of ports by Napoleon, and that made the export market increasingly fraught. Although it was tried to be resurrected, it finally closed in 1821. So that resulted in the closures and consolidations of a number of Burton's brewers, such that there were only 4 of them left by the 1820s. And those names were Bass, Worthington, Allsop, and Salts, names which we're going to hear a fair bit about over the next century or so. So those 4 now refocused on the UK domestic market, where Burton's growing reputation for good quality beers had given them a competitive edge, or so they thought. But in the absence of cheap, reliable transport in the early 1800s, Burton's brewers couldn't really challenge the big market, which obviously was London, and the porter sales there. But they couldn't compete basically on price with the London brewers. Or in any of the other towns, but by that time, so early 1800s, most provincial towns had got their own breweries, who was supplying their local markets basically. But North America and the growing colonial empire that Great Britain had got by the 1820s did both offer significant growth opportunities. especially since the recently opened Trent and Mersey Canal offered a route to the docks at Liverpool. So India was a potentially attractive market, given that we had both an army there of soldiers and we had an army of civil servants. And both of those occupations developed a thirst, particularly given the climate of India. So you've got a lot of people out there, ex-Brits, in a very hot climate. So why wouldn't you? But as we've already heard, the East India Company approached Allsop, first Mr. Allsop and his brewer, and they started to brew in Burton a new bitter sparkling ale for India in competition with the London brewers. It was the London brewers who first started that trade, and as we already heard as well, it was a gentleman called Mark Hodgson. He was credited with developing the first of this, what he called his India ale. And you could get the exporting beer, exporting anything to India was very cheap because most of the trade was coming east to west. So you could export beer cheaply, and by the East India Company. And Hodgson was sending his beer to Madras and Calcutta and Bombay. But to quote a well-known brewery writer of the time, I thought you might like that slide, it says a lot to me, but Burton Pale Ale had the remarkable virtue of arriving pale, clear and sparkling, which implies that a lot of the other beer arriving there was anything but. So it became a huge success. Burton brewers, especially the India Pale Ale, East India Pale Ale, shortened to IPA. By the 1830s, Allsop and Bass dominated that trade to India. And Burton Pale Ale started to increase in popularity in the home market. And by 1832, so it's 10 years on down the line, Bass's total annual barrelage was just still south of 15,000 barrels, but more than 5,000 of that was going to Bengal alone. But it started to grow in popularity in the home market. As I said, there's this apocryphal story, I've heard it numerous times around the country, but of a shipwreck, a ship leaving Liverpool full of casks of Burton ale, and it foundered on the shortly after leaving Liverpool, and a lot of the barrels ended up on ashore, and they were all auctioned off by a local auction house and sold in Liverpool. And after that, the trade never looked back. I guess price had something to do with it, but whenever. And I know it's going to be talked about later, so I'm not going to mention it too much now, but a significant factor in the success of Burton's beers in the India trade was the quality of the hard brewing water, or liquor as we call it, initially drawn from wells, but later from deep boreholes, 300 foot down or more. Not only did the water have a very high mineral content, but it was also free from any organic sediments. And it wasn't until about a century later it was established that the high levels of gypsum in Burton's brewing liquor it exerts positive effects, not right throughout the brewing process, mashing, work boiling, fermentation, and yeast handling. And it's that which helps contribute and keeps the beer clear and bright, able to withstand long sea journeys. Right, can I hit the sorry, okay, that's Liverpool docks for you. Moving on. It should be stressed that the commercial risks involved in exporting beer to India in the 1800s were considerable. It wasn't all sweetness and light. In part, it was just due to the sheer number of different companies and organisations which had to be involved in the process. You had merchants, bankers, ship owners and insurance houses, both in UK and overseas. And you could get fluctuations in prices taking place during the length of time taken for beer from leaving the UK to arrive in India. But the biggest single risk, it has to be admitted, was a deterioration in the quality of the beer during the journey. They didn't all make it, especially when you're travelling through tropical climates. And you get also a significant amount of container damage and leakage. There's lots of records showing that happening and the consequences of it, people blaming one another. So the commercial viability of shipping draft beer to India was definitely highly dependent on the high gross profit margins which were generated, that the trade could generate to cover the associated risks. And it's also worth remembering, we're talking about the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, it wasn't until the late 1870s that brewing was anything other than a seasonal occupation. You could only brew beer from September through to March. The high summer temperatures made it just impossible. There was no understanding of what yeast was or what fermentation was. And that's something I'll come back to later. But in 1839, the opening of the Midland Railway line through Burton enabled a rapid expansion of Burton's beers within the domestic market. And it's that, really, which helped the transformation of Burton into the UK, if not the world's preeminent brewing town. Over the next 20 years, the extension of the railway system, it linked Burton to all the major population centres of the country. And during that time, the mid-1800s now, the Industrial Revolution was in full swing. And you had the rapidly growing manufacturing and mining towns of the North, the West Midlands and South Wales. They provided an almost limitless market for Burton's beers. Burton was really the only town, well, exporting beers, travelling and capable of exporting them. So next slide, please. I just thought I'd introduce a bit of, I know this is a celebration of beer this afternoon, but don't forget, the rapid growth in the urban population was accompanied by a significant increase in real income, so that the wages for most manual workers certainly surged ahead of prices. It meant there was a growing class of urban manual workers, and they were easily the largest consumers of beer, and they'd had more money in their pockets than ever before, and they didn't have many ways of spending it, and most of those wages went on beer. And you can understand, looking at those pictures, and there's lots like that, the working conditions of most people in the mid-1800s were atrocious. It was terrible. And their domestic living accommodation was pretty dire as well. And beer offered an alternative. It was a stop in many ways. And that's where the big market for Burton's beers came from. And also at the time, after 1830, it was the Duke of Wellington who introduced the Beer House Act, which basically anybody could open a beer house. I think you paid a guinea or something, and you could get a license. You could sell beer in your back room, front room, whatever. So, given a huge expansion in the volume of beer drinking, the demand for it, the licensed trade could easily rise to the increase in demand in the form of either beer houses or full-on licenses. It was just an easy way of making money. So I think it's worth remembering just what prevailing living conditions were like in the mid-1800s. The next slide, please. This perhaps a more slightly easier on the eyes example of the public house trade against men, women, children. There was no licensing restrictions as such in those days. The number of brewing companies in Burton began to increase. There were 5 in 1818, and you've heard the number, 9 by 1834, 16 brewing companies in 1851, and over 30 by the 1870s and 80s. And these guys were not just brewer traders, they were serious commercial, full-time specialist brewers involved in buying serious bits of brewing kit and developing the industry, basically. So, next slide, please. Yeah, just shows the increase in numbers of breweries across the town during the time period we're talking about. Some of you might recognise those, top right anyway. Edie's, Salts, Worthington. Can I have just bring it home for us, please? Yeah. The sheer scale of growth in brewing during the latter half of the 19th century, 8 brewing companies, in 1830, 8 brewing companies produced 50,000 barrels. By the 1900s, there was 20 companies employing 8,000 men and boys and producing 3.5 million barrels. And that's 10% of the UK's total beer output. So to get from 50,000 to 3.5 million, that's one heck of a growth. And over half of that was produced by Bass and Allsop. They were by far the two leading companies in the town. But there were others. So please, just some of the others. It's interesting to look at where they came from. 2 of those companies there were started by guys who started out in the malting industry, supplying the Burton brewers. So Salts was a maltster to begin with, and so was Edie. But as already been referred to, come the 1850s, 1860s, Burton was becoming very famous, and a number of the London brewers thought there's something going on, we better get part of that action, and so a number of London brewers came up and opened breweries here. And the first one was Iron Coop. It was in Essex really, but from Burton on Trent we could call it London. Charrington's followed in the 1870s. There was Mann, Crossman and Pauling came up, and Truman, Hanbury, Buxton. And as we've already been mentioned, Truman's were here, stayed till the 1970s. But, next slide, Maestro, thank you. As I already said, the dominance of the brewing in the town was Allsop and Bass. They were the major employers in the town. They played a leading role in the technical development of brewing during the late 19th century. Allsop's was the first brewing company in the world to employ a leading chemist, and the other major brewers followed suit as well. As we said, they employed a chemist mainly because there was a lot of flack in the press from pseudo medics who were complaining of finding all kinds of spurious components in beer allegedly. So Allsop's acquired Dr. Boetinger, I think, a famous German chemist, to refute some of these allegations in the medical press. It's just both these companies, they exploited the market for pale ale as much as they could. They developed the market and they exploited it. Next. Okay, this is just. I'd have to do this short notice, so I had to take all my stuff I've got from Bass. But I'm trying to include also as much as I can. But I mean, say again, I'm a technical man of car, so numbers impress me. You know, the annual output increasing from 40,000 barrels in the 1840s to 148 10 years later. And then you build a second brewery over in Gill Street there. And over the next 10 years, your output doubles to 380,000 barrels. So you build another brewery, the number 2 at Station Street, but still left. By 1870, output 600,000 barrels. And you go up another 10 years, you get to 900,000 barrels. That is huge growth by anybody's yardsticks. And Bass became the largest ale brewer in the world. And we always qualify by saying it's an ale brewer. There was only Arthur Guinness in Dublin who had a bigger operation. But other than that, that's the biggest brewery in the world. During the same time, Allsop saw similar growth, 80,000 barrels in 1850, 270,000 by 1861, and got up to about 750,000 by the 1870s. So huge demand. And just again, as I've already said, brewing's still a seasonal occupation. You're only brewing from September time through to April. Although, you know, a lot of the technical developments and advances went into say what's the limiting factor there, and how can we brew more. And the town's population during this time increased from a mere 6,500 to 50,000. And there's some particular, you know, the percentage of the workforce employed in Burton, either indirectly in brewing or in the all the ancillary engineering, metal bashing enterprises that the town's associated with, was very, very high, about 2/3. I'll just put that in pictures for you, just please, give you some idea of a kind of a Victorian scale of things. Bass employed 2,000 men and boys with a weekly wage bill of £2,000. And the sheer physical size of the Burton operation was just purely amazing to visitors. By 1874, the 3 breweries occupied 150 acres. There were 6 miles of private railway track, 580,000 casks were held in stock, and got 6 steam locos and 80 cart horses to transport it around. It was a Victorian mega operation. And another factor that's worth throwing in is the increased popularity of Burton brewed pale ale during the Victorian era was greatly assisted by the repeal of the excise duty on glass in 1845, which encouraged both the bottling of beer for the home trade and the substitution of glass, by glass of pewter tankards and pots in the licensed trade. And so these changes, that you had a gradual modification of public attitude towards beer. The market strength of porter, which had been the major beer type up until this era, porter, it was known for its alcoholic strength and its nourishing qualities. Burton Pale Ale rather sold itself not only on strength but flavour, but more. It's light, clear, sparkling. It was about appearance as much as anything. And there's a quote here from Barnard, which I particularly like. Or from Porter, sombre hue, foaming head, no longer the head of fashion. A bright, clear, sparkling bitter, the colour of sherry and the condition of champagne. Make a note of that, Jim. And you know, I particularly like a glass of sherry occasionally, and I'm always portioning of champagne. If you can hit that, then you've got something going. It was Bass and Allsop, the 2 great Burton brewers, who stimulated what was in effect a revolution in popular taste. The success of their beers, especially their pale ales, rested on superior quality in terms of flavour and appearance, but also consistency. That's worth remembering as well. My job was all about consistency, really. It's all right getting the occasional brew that's absolutely right, but one thing I've learnt from 30-odd years in the brewing industry, beer drinkers, because they're drinking volumes, usually significant volumes, they want it consistently. If you're asking for a particular brand of beer, you want it to be the same on Monday nights as Friday nights, or whatever. It's got to be consistent, and there's a skill in doing that, as Jim and Steve both know. And Mr. Ambler, I see at the back. There's a few brewers here. It's all about doing it day in, day out, and producing it to the same standard. Next slide, please. Regional offices. Distribution and marketing arrangements for both Bass and Allsop reflected their all-pervading confidence in their beers. Both companies initially relied on a national network of independent wholesale bottling firms who acted as their agents in the major population centres, and also in smaller, more remote locations, they used either wine and spirit merchants or local brewers. But in all cases, the agents received the bulk of their beer in bulk by rail from Burton, and then they distributed it for the local trade. The profit margins allowed to these wholesalers had to be generous. A dozen pint bottles of IPA, which they were retailing at 4 shillings, they'd be supplied to the wholesaler at about 2 and 6pence. So they give generous margins, but that encouraged agents to promote Burton beers in the retail trade. And in practice, they undertook a lot of Bass and Allsop's advertising for them. and such advertising usually stressed the physical and medicinal benefits which consumers of Burton ale could expect. And so, the next slide, please. This is from a 1844 advert for beer. Prescribed by invalids, the most celebrated physicians, Dr. Prout, examined in his work on the diseases of the stomach after condemning common ales, especially recommends this to weakly persons. In excellent condition in casks and bottles at their appointed agents, Henry Berry Brothers and Rudd from St James's, you know. You can say those sort of things anymore, Harry? Probably not. Well, you can, Jim, but it was essential to retain the goodwill of bottling firms, since neither of the two Burton brewers owned any public houses, certainly not until the 1870s, 1880s, and therein lies a problem. So if you don't own any pubs, you're dependent on the goodwill of your brand name and local connections. Local independent bottlers were therefore an essential link in Burton Brewers distribution chain. And I'll just, next slide, please. That is a beer house. So that's actually Whitechapel in London. As I said earlier, anybody could get a license to open a premise like that, and there were no such things as licensing hours particularly. So open up, sell beer. Heavily dependent on the free working of supply and demand and unrestriction of any tied supply arrangement was also reflected in the emphasis both Bass and Allsop placed on their respective trademarks. Both companies aimed to impress their own brand image on the mind of the beer drinker, so that it would instantly recognise Bass's Red Triangle and Allsop's Red Hand and associate them with top quality beer. It's quite simple, but it's very effective, and no one had ever done it before. And the London brewers certainly didn't do it for decades later, to actually take a simple, call it icon, I think, these days, and associate it with quality. That's why the quality of the product had to be absolutely right, and people would ask for either a Bass or an Allsop. And so you say that was hugely successful bit of brand marketing, I think they call it these days. But then it created its own problem, as how do you stop the more unscrupulous bottlers from mixing Burton ale with inferior beer and selling it either under the Bass or Allsop labels. And the two companies brought numerous prosecutions against bottlers and publicans and sometimes other brewers who tampered with their beer, but it did remain an inherent weakness of the system. So next slide, please. Bass in particular, these are examples of export agents for the company. They require their approved bottlers to put their own name alongside the red triangle, signifying the bottler personally guaranteed the authenticity of the product. But it's a big weakness if you're not bottling it yourself. You're relying on other people. I know when I joined the company, the department I joined, the number of outside bottling. What's your job? Well, look after outside bottlers and contract keggers. And it was still a big. The remnants of that operation were still evident in the company a century later. So. Between 1849 and 1880, that's the purple patch, those 30 years or so. Easily the most dynamic sector of the brewing industry was Burton-on-Trent. After 1880, however, the centre of gravity gradually moved away from Burton towards the growing cities in and towns of the north and the Midlands. And during the 1880s, both Bass and Allsop had to fight hard to maintain their market share. And by the 1890s, it's fair to say Burton's supremacy was rapidly coming to an end. In part, this was due to scientific and technological advances made during the latter half of the 19th century. 1870, Pasteur published his studies on beer, and there was a huge wealth of understanding arose in terms of what yeast is, nature of fermentation, the technical advances in mashing and work boiling, whatever. People understood better what it was about Burton that was special, and other brewers began to catch on. They didn't have to send wagon loads of water down across the country. They could do it there and therein, and the product quality of Burton's beers began to be matched elsewhere. But an even more important factor was that from the 1870s onwards, provincial brewers began to extend their control over more and more licensed houses, either by direct ownership or by loan tie arrangements. And one of the drivers for that was that after the 1870s, there was a levelling off in the in beer volumes. For the first time in over 30 years, volumes didn't rise annually. In fact, they began to fall back a bit. And even more, there have been 3 decades, an even more critical factor was the imposition of ever more restrictive licensing laws. The overall effect, which was, in fact, it made an application for the license trade, either for new licenses or for license renewal, ever more difficult. It was no longer just straightforward. So when you got an era, all of a sudden beer volumes are not going up every year. You've got a static beer market. You've got a license trade which is becoming more and more regulated and fraught. It was inevitable that regional brewers began to started buying public houses and tying them, and that's essentially what happened. I think that's fair to say that caught both Bass and also out to an extent. So that was a bit. Say that's the end of the story basically in terms of Burton's rise to world fame. I'll just say in conclusion, any stories relating to beer in brewing, and what I've tried to do, it's important that you look at whatever happens within the social and historical context of the time. This kind of retro analysing of situations in terms of the modern context. I've got very little time for it, to be honest. The era which saw the growth and dominance of India Pale Ale and Burton-on-Trent also saw the evidence of it was a time of the Industrial Revolution, which brought huge benefits to people, but also created some major problems. In the 18th century and the early 19th century, beer in the pub was seen as important elements of society. By the end of the 19th century, there was an increasingly influential body of opinion that was the opinion that alcoholic drinks and the public house were at the root cause of the nation's social and economic problems. You've got to deal with public relations here. Arguments in favour of temperance and even outright abolition gained such a momentum at the end of the 19th century, early years of the 20th century, and the brewing industry had to fight a running battle for those who wished to see it legislated out of existence. So it wasn't a particularly happy ending, but that went on for about 20 years, temperance and prohibition movements. So that's as much as I would like to say at this moment, but I hope I'll give you some context for how it all happened. Thank you. Oh, last slide. That photo was taken in the early 1960s, 60, 61. You want to take a look at it later. Spot the breweries. There's 4 or 5 of them there. That's all sorts down the bottom right-hand corner there. The Bass Old Brewery. We're just up here somewhere. There's the Worthington Brewery, Bass Middle, the new brewery. There's Robinson's and Bindley's, and they're all in there. They're all still there in the early 60s. So a bit of Burton history for you. Yes. Sorry. Please do.
Prior to the advent of IPA, what were the beer styles and particular qualities of the beer from Burton that gave them opportunities, albeit a lot smaller than when IPA took off, for export to, you said, the Baltic states, Prussia?
Yeah.
Like this? What was it that these places saw in Burton Ale at the time?
It's very hard to say because there's not much documented. I mean, Burton was known as a brown ale. It was Burton Brown Ale was on sale in London, and there's records of that. But I guess it was drinkable. Let's keep it simple. It would travel that way, and it was going as ballast as much as anything, as I've already mentioned. You know, you've got ships coming in from Hull, laden with timber and steel or whatever, and the ship owners wanted something to portray back. So it started just as ballast, but it was drinkable. It was decent beer in the context of the time, and compared with its competition, and it could travel. And there was no other beer. Say every town had its own brewery at the time, but they all operated within about a 5-mile radius because the beer wouldn't keep. And transport was terrible anyway in the UK. So the fact that you could send a beer, you could load barges with beer, get it up to Hull, put it on there. I guess it grew by happenstance, and the fact that the quality of the beer was good. But there's no firm descriptions as to what it was, I'm afraid. Not that I'm aware of.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Harry.
All right.